Hi everyone, welcome back to the journey of my YouTube channel and welcome to my first YouTube video of 2025, which is also coincidentally my favorite video of the year, even though it comes right at the beginning of the year. It's always my favorite and it's my top 10 reads of the year video. I always love looking back on my last year of reading and picking out the 10 books that I thought were the very best, or at least the 10 books that I personally enjoyed the most. I do tend to be pretty subjective with my picks, but to some degree I think that's how you just have to assemble a top 10 list. So I always think it's really fun to see other people's lists of their favorite books and get a bunch of recommendations for the new reading year. And I hope that some of the books that I am talking about today will grab your interest and maybe you'll want to add them to your 2025 TBR. Coming in at number 10 is a book that I read right at the beginning of 2024, and that is The Blood Race by K.A. Emmons. And The Blood Race is a bit of like a Harry Potter or Percy Jackson kind of story, except with college kids rather than more like middle schoolers. So I really enjoyed seeing a lot of those familiar fantasy elements of something of a chosen one, discovering that he has magical powers and getting brought into this magical world with a mentor, meeting new friends, working together to save the world kind of thing. A lot of familiar elements, but we usually see that with younger kids. We don't get to see that with college students as much, and so I enjoyed kind of that different age group, making those tropes feel fresher again. And as much as this book is a fantasy, it has a bit more of a sci-fi flavor. Parts of the book, the parts that are set in our world, are very contemporary. The feel of the magical world is pretty unique and different from what I usually see in a portal fantasy kind of situation, and it also has some more like thriller-like or mystery elements. So there's quite a bit of genre blending that goes on, and that makes this, even though it has a lot of familiar elements, it still felt like a really unique story to me, and that gave it a very quick page turning kind of experience. I found that once I started reading this book, I would not want to stop. So I ended up, and it's not a very long book either, so I ended up reading it very, very fast. There was just always a new mystery to uncover. There was always another action piece happening or another interesting character reveal going on. I thought that for being a fast-paced book, it balanced the character development with that really well. There was definitely a lot that was interesting and thought-provoking, and not just action set pieces kind of things. So a really nice balance there, and I was just really impressed with it. I ended up really enjoying it. I actually have a signed copy of it, so that is extra awesome. So I would recommend this book to people who are fans of series like Harry Potter and Percy Jackson, but have probably gotten a little bit older since they read those series. People who really like familiar fantasy elements, but are looking for something that's a little bit different, a little bit more genre blending. And people who would like a quick, fast-paced, easy read that is still going to be engaging on a character development and theme level. Number 9 is For the Wolf, which I have already talked about in my fall library haul video and also my Fablin Readathon wrap-up video. So I will link to both of those so that you can see what I've already said about For the Wolf. I honestly don't really remember that much of what I've already said about For the Wolf, but basically of the several romantic-y kinds of books that I read this year, For the Wolf was basically the one that I enjoyed. I am very picky about this type of genre, and I tend to like the premise and really like the cover, but then a lot of times the execution of this style of story just doesn't quite work for me. I had several of those this year that were kind of hit and miss, and possibly mostly miss. So that's probably part of the reason why I enjoyed For the Wolf so much, because I was comparing it to these other books that didn't work for me as well, and so there were a lot of elements that For the Wolf did that I felt that it did better than other books I read that were similar to it. For the Wolf is the story of Red, who gets sent into the forest as basically a sacrifice to the wolf to protect her people from the dangerous Wilderwood that she's getting sent into. But once she gets there, things are not what she thought they were. It's a very fairy tale-ish kind of story. At the same time, Red's sister stays behind in the kingdom. She's the slightly older sister, so she's the one in line for the throne. The next book in the series is about her, and Red's sister has several chapters throughout the book as well that I initially thought I wasn't going to feel like those POVs were necessary, but I ended up actually finding them really interesting, and they kind of had their own story within a story throughout the book that I ended up finding really interesting, and I stopped being disappointed when I saw that the next chapter was going to be one of those interlude chapters. Initially, I felt like Red was maybe going to be the very stereotypical YA female protagonist who's just kind of generally angry for no reason, doesn't take a lot of responsibility for her actions, and kind of treats everybody badly and yet gets treated well by everybody anyway. I was afraid that we were going that direction, but then that was not at all what happened. And I really appreciated seeing how Red grew over the course of the story into a much more likable person. I really appreciated within the romantic relationship, but then also in the other relationships, that there was a lot of genuine selflessness and just people taking care of each other, and sometimes actually listening to each other and making somewhat reasonable decisions based on what other people said, which I just found really refreshing. I also enjoyed the setting a whole lot. I love me a good forest setting. I love some ruined castle vibes, and this book just had all the fun with that kind of setup that it possibly could. It was a bit of a long book, but I didn't mind at all. I didn't even mind the somewhat slower sections from a plot standpoint because I was just having so much fun with the characters in the world. So I ended up really enjoying this one. I am planning to read the second book. It sounds like a very different setting and atmosphere than book one, so I don't know if I'll enjoy it as much or not, but I was definitely interested in hearing more after the first book. So I would recommend it to people who enjoy the romantasy genre. It is a little bit more of an adult book versus YA than I thought it was, so probably a little bit older readers rather than younger teens, like maybe I thought that it would be before I read it. But also, if you've been a little bit frustrated by romantasy books in the past, this may be one that you would still find worth giving a try. Number 8 is The Princess Bride, which is another one that I read for Fablin, another one that I talked about in that wrap-up video a little bit. I was not expecting to be a huge fan of the book because I just hadn't heard that many good things about it, even from people who really like the movie, which I find interesting and a little surprising because the book is so similar to the movie. And I actually ended up enjoying the book probably even more than the movie, because you just get more of the internal character dynamics that way, just a little bit more detail on what the characters are actually thinking and feeling and how the plot is affecting them. I think you all probably know the story of The Princess Bride. You probably all know that it is about Buttercup and Wesley and swashbuckling adventures and rescues and sword fights and daring cliff climbing and lots of humorous escapades, but also surprisingly real and deep thematic material, at least in the book. I was surprised how much substance the book really seemed to have, especially given the frame story that the author built around it, which really gave a whole different perspective and lens for looking at the story than what you get from the movie. So I just found it a way more interesting reading experience than I was expecting. And there's something for a story that is just about true love, even if that's done in a silly way sometimes on purpose. There's just still something to the fact that this is about people who are willing to do pretty much anything for each other, and they get to have a lot of fun while doing it, and we get to have a lot of fun while reading about it. So I enjoyed that a lot. I would definitely recommend this to fans of the movie because it is basically the experience of watching the movie just in book form. And in general, if you like the old classic adventure story kind of book, I think you'll really enjoy this. Honestly, it's much less of a fantasy book than I thought. It's really written more as if it's a history book. It just happens to take place in a country that is fictional, but the entire thing is played as if this is just a historical occurrence that happened. So really, I would say like fans of The Count of Monte Cristo and The Three Musketeers and that kind of story would probably enjoy The Princess Bride a lot more than they might think given the title and the movie's reputation. Number 7 is Ender in Exile, which I know this particular copy doesn't really have anything on the cover, but there is the spine as proof that this is indeed Ender in Exile. So this is one of the many sequels to Ender's Game. Ender's Game being the really well-known book in the series about a little boy who gets trained as a military commander and fights a war in space against aliens, even though he doesn't realize that that's what he's doing. And I hope you kind of knew that story because I sort of gave it away. But anyway, after the book Ender's Game, there are several different sequels and spin-offs and follow-up books. And this is an interesting one because this is the most direct sequel to Ender's Game. It takes place the most shortly after the events of Ender's Game. Ender is the main character. It deals with a lot of the other characters and circumstances from the original book, but it was written after a lot of other sequels and spin-offs had already been written for Ender's Game, so it's more of a midquel really within the larger world of the Enderverse. But what's really strange is that I think this actually reads as the best finale to the whole series, the whole Enderverse that we have. There is an official last book of the series, but unfortunately I didn't find that to be as satisfying as I want it to be, and based on reviews most people didn't either. But I actually find this book, oddly enough, even though it's the second book chronologically after Ender's Game, I actually find it working really well as a conclusion to the whole series. It just kind of ties everything up from a thematic standpoint and sort of brings things back to the beginning in a way, brings things full circle. So, in other words, if you are a big fan of Ender's Game, I think you will really like Ender in Exile, and I would definitely recommend it. You do really need to read Ender's Game first, and I think it's best if you read some of the other books in the Enderverse first as well. The other odd thing about this book is that I feel like as a novel, it's actually not that great because there are kind of two different major plot lines that happen in the book, and they don't intersect that much. They don't flow into each other that much. So if you're just approaching it by itself as a novel, it kind of doesn't flow at all. But all of the things that happen in this book are really fantastic things. Both of the plot lines are so good that for me that actually completely overcame the fact that there are sort of two different plot lines weirdly stuck together in this story, and I still ended up really enjoying the book as a whole. And again, as a capstone to the whole series, I felt like it worked. So that is definitely something that I'm not sure everyone would agree with, but that was my take on Ender in Exile. We just get so much more of the classic Ender interacting with other people kinds of episodes that are actually my favorite thing about the Enderverse series. It's one of the few books in the series where Ender is actually the primary character and where we get most of the book just being Ender doing cool stuff. So I enjoyed it like crazy. It's become something of a tradition for me to have Ender books on my top 10 list, and this year is no exception. I just keep reading more Ender books. I kind of can't stop. As far as who I would recommend the whole Ender series to, just in general, sci-fi fans and also people who really love character-driven and psychologically deep and complex stories. Even if you're not the biggest fan of sci-fi, I think the Ender's Game series is one that you would still enjoy if you really like those very deep, fleshed out character elements, because that's really what the heart of the series is, rather than anything about technology or aliens. Number 6 is Skandar and the Unicorn Thief, which is the first in a series that now has 3 more books out. Book 5, the final book, is coming out later this year, but not until September. I am so sad that we still have a long wait for the final book in the series, but at least we have book 1, which is probably still my favorite book of the series so far. So this is another story that has a lot of similar elements to the Harry Potter, Percy Jackson type of story, also a lot of similar elements to Eragon. So the very classic hero's journey. Kid discovers he has magic powers and is kind of the chosen one and gets taken to a magical realm where he has a mentor, makes friends. I would say Skandar more has like multiple mentors, but he makes friends and is fighting evil, is having to stand up against the threats of a villain while also having to uncover some mysteries and just deal with the realities of being a school kid. So this one is in the more typical middle school age. Skandar is 13 in this first book, and as you would expect, he gets 1 year older in each of the subsequent books. And if this sounds like a very familiar story so far, it is, but again, I still found it to feel very much unique enough to keep me interested. I really like Skandar as a character. He's just this very nice kid, which I guess also probably sounds a little bit vanilla and not super interesting, but he's just a really nice kid, and I especially like his relationship with his sister, which definitely goes interesting places throughout the series, and his friendships with the other members of his quartet, as they call a grouping of 4 students together on the Unicorn Island. I also really liked each of the characters' relationships with their unicorns, because that's basically the magical element in the series, as you guess from the cover and the title, is that some people are bonded to unicorns. They become unicorn riders. And the unicorns themselves are very much characters with a lot of personality, and each of the riders has a unique relationship with their unicorn. So that's always fun to see. And some of the riders just click with the unicorns immediately. Some of the riders kind of struggle in their relationships with their unicorns. It's just different for everybody. And there are a bunch of internal politics and different factions on the Unicorn Island where all the kids train. So it's just a really fun book. I kind of don't know what else to say about it except that it is a lot of fun. There's good character development. The world building is really enjoyable. And yes, it feels very much like the type of story that I've read before, and yet it feels like its own new story at the same time. With the subsequent books in the series, I've been a little bit more conflicted. There have been a lot of things about them that I've really liked. There have been some things about them that haven't been my favorites. The ending of book 4, I really like book 4 in general, but the ending of book 4 definitely left me uncertain about how I feel about how things are heading for book 5. So hopefully book 5 is going to be a really good conclusion. But regardless, book 1 I still think is just basically perfect. I really didn't have anything that I would have changed about it. There was one big twist that I thought was a little easy to guess, but I still like the twist anyway. So overall, just a lot of fun. And if you want more stories of the variety of Harry Potter, Percy Jackson, Aragon, that kind of thing, then like this is your guy. This is your next read. Number 5 is War and Peace, which I feel like, how do you rank War and Peace among other books? It's kind of impossible to compare with other books. So I wasn't sure how to rank this really. So that's kind of why I put it middle of the list, because it's obviously one of the best books, like one of the best fiction books that's been written. But how do you compare War and Peace to other books? But anyway, I'm not going to talk about it at length because I've actually already filmed another video specifically about War and Peace. So I'll kind of let that speak for itself when it comes out. But basically, this book gets kind of a hard rap for being so long. I think people assume that because it's so long, that it's really boring. And because a lot of people try to read it and don't make it, people think that it's really boring. But it's actually very fascinating. And there are kind of 2 elements to the book. I mean, there are a lot more, but 2 of the main elements are the war and the peace, unsurprisingly. But there are a lot of battle scenes, and there are a lot of, like, back on the home front, more character-driven scenes. So there's actually a lot of action. There's a lot of fighting, a lot of war tactics and strategy. So that's really interesting in one way. And then there's also the very character-driven, domestic, psychological, spiritual sections just about humanity. And so those are really fascinating and gripping in a different way. And to have both of them in one book, and so much of both of them in one book, really makes for a cool experience. And then there are also these sections that are basically nonfiction, just talking for a while about topics like war and peace. And that sounds like it would be boring, but it's actually also really interesting if you go to the mental work to really digest what Tolstoy is saying in those areas. So I actually loved reading this. It did take me a very long time. It took me, I think, about 8 months to read, which usually I would read books in 1 to 2 months, if not less. So this is about the longest time I've ever spent reading a single book. But it was definitely worth it, in my opinion, to spoil what I'm going to say in my video on War and Peace. And I definitely think that more people should attempt to read it, because we don't want this to be lost in the generations just because people think it's a boring school assignment of a book, because it is definitely not. So I would recommend this to people who love classics, who are willing to take on the challenge of a big read. If you read big chunky fantasy books a lot, then you'll probably be primed to really make the most of a book like this. If you just don't have time for a book of this magnitude right now, then that is totally understandable. But if you do have the time, and if you do have that kind of reading stamina, then I would definitely recommend. At number 4, we have The Sum of All Men, which is book 1 of the series, The Rune Lords. This is another one that I read during the Phaelin Readathon, so that is also covered in that video. And this one was so interesting because I just saw it at a library. I just saw the spine of the book, and I saw the title and just a little bit of the cover, and I saw the author. I recognized the author's name, and I just grabbed it, and I was like, we're going to give this a try. We're going to go for it. This could be a horrible idea. And I ended up really just being completely blown away by the book. It was another one where I started out a little uncertain. I wasn't sure if I loved the characters at the beginning, but they totally grew on me. I came to really like the character development. The plot was really interesting. I mean, like most big fantasy books, it had its slow areas, but the not slow areas more than made up for it. I think probably the most impressive thing, in fact, I'm pretty positive the most impressive thing in the book is the world building. The world building is incredible. It has simultaneously a very hard magic system where everything is very measured, everything is very calculable. Very much if you do X, then Y will happen. If you modify X in this way, then that will modify Y in this way. So you can know exactly what the results of a given thing are going to be. But at the same time, the world also still has that feel of you never know what's going to come around the next corner. There are all kinds of crazy fantasy creatures, like crazy unique and interesting fantasy creatures just popping up. There's a lot of interesting history and lore to the world. So the hard magic system never makes it feel too rigid or like you understand too much about the world. It still leaves so much left to be discovered. And even the hard magic system itself, like it's very simple to understand on the surface, but then the author just keeps peeling back more and more layers of like, well, but what if you did this with it? But what if you did this with it? What if you took this to its farthest extent? Then what would happen? So there's just always more to discover. There are quite a lot more books in the series, so there's quite a bit more material for those books to explore. And I definitely want to read at least one more book in the series and see if it stays as good as the first one, because the first one just impressed me like crazy, and I'm glad that I randomly picked it up off of a library shelf. I would recommend this to people who like adult fantasy, specifically like big epic adult fantasy that is not grimdark specifically. It definitely has a lot of darkness present, but the overall worldview also has a lot of hope and a lot of goodness and genuine heroism and that kind of thing. Number 3 is The Once and Future King, which is actually a collection of 4 novellas into one, but all put together is basically one of the most famous, most classic treatments of the story of King Arthur. And I got interested in King Arthur a couple of years ago, and since then I've been reading about all the King Arthur books that I can. I find the story interesting every time. It's so frustrating every time, and I think that's part of why I keep wanting to read another story and another story, because every time I keep hoping for some reason that it's not going to be really frustrating this time, and then like guess what? The story is still frustrating, but it's also really fascinating. I mean, you can never explore all of the ways that you can see or retell the King Arthur story. It's just so foundational to all of the fantasy stories that have come after it. The most famous part of The Once and Future King is the first novella, which is called The Sword and the Stone, and that's what the Disney movie The Sword and the Stone was made out of. And that story is all about young Arthur, and Merlin turns him into a bunch of different animals, and each animal teaches Arthur a different lesson about becoming king. And I actually read The Sword and the Stone back in 2023, and I was so conflicted about it. I mentioned it in a video where I was like, I do not know what to think about this book. I appreciate a lot of things about it, a lot of sections of impressive writing, a lot of really interesting things, but also it's very episodic, it's very strange, and it kind of left me like, I don't even really feel like I read a King Arthur story. I feel like I read a way more serious and bizarre, like Winnie the Pooh style story or something. I was not sure about it at all. But then I read the other novellas, and I actually liked them a lot more than The Sword and the Stone. They focused a lot more on Arthur and the traditional Arthur plotline, and the other characters who surround Arthur in that, specifically Lancelot and Guinevere, are probably the ones who get the most attention. Also, Gawain and his brothers and their mom are kind of central to the second novella, which was my favorite of the 4 novellas. And pretty much this book is about doing a deep dive into each of these characters and their motivations, basically why they did what they did and what it was like for them and the effect that that had on them. And so it's a very I've used this word a lot in this video. It's a very character-driven approach to the King Arthur story, and it cares less about what happened. It definitely doesn't care about when it happened, because it tells the whole King Arthur story in the 1500s, which makes no sense. But what it really cares about is who is in the story and what the story means for them. I did read somebody saying about the Once and Future King after I had read the book that like it's basically just Freudian psychoanalysis of all the characters in the Arthur story, and I was like, well, I don't really like that description, but it's kind of true. So that maybe took my opinion of the book down a little bit, because I was like, well, yes, that is basically just what this is. However, I still really enjoyed it, and I still think that there was a lot in it that was very insightful, very moving, and it's a really interesting take on the Arthur story. That it's no surprise that it's had such an impact on pretty much every retelling of the Arthur story since. I would recommend this to people who do like the King Arthur story, as long as they do like a lot of psychoanalysis and are not really here for the action so much as the questions about what it means to be a good ruler, and what maybe drove the various characters in the traditional Arthur stories to do the things that they did. Number 2 is The Neverending Story, which is another one that I read during the Fabelin Readathon. It was a good readathon. I mean, a lot of my favorite books of the year came out of it. I actually love this one so much that I strongly considered it making it my number 1 read of the year. It kind of could be. I will probably continue going back and forth in my mind over which of these books really deserved it. So I actually got introduced to The Neverending Story first through the movie, which I really loved. But the book is interesting because the first half of the book pretty much is what you see in the movie. It's that plot. There are a couple episodes in the book that didn't make it into the movie, but basically what you see in the movie is what you get in the first half of the book. However, the second half of the book is almost like its own separate plot. I said in my previous video where I talked about this book, it's almost like The Neverending Story is a duology, just in one volume, because the two halves are rather separate. However, I really loved both halves of the story enough that I didn't mind the fact that maybe made the pacing a little bit weird. The first half of the story is basically your typical hero's journey kind of story, and I can totally see why they made a movie out of just that part. It has the adventure and the action and the crazy creatures that you would expect to see from this type of story. It's the story of a bullied little boy named Bastien who gets his hands, through some rather questionable means, on a book called The Neverending Story, and he runs away to his school attic and spends the day reading this book. So the main story in that portion is the book that Bastien is reading, but then we also get check-ins back with Bastien as he's reading the book, and his own experience and the book start melding in some interesting ways. And then in the very middle of the book, the dynamic totally changes, and then in the second half of the book we have a pretty different, still connected but pretty different experience. And this poor kid Bastien basically gets just taken apart and shown the darkest parts of himself, and forced to change in very fundamental ways as a human being. And it's a little hard to read because I'm like, this poor kid's 12, but it's also such a profound character arc, and the conclusions that it comes to and the imagery that it uses to symbolize what's going on is just crazy. It just all worked together into a book that I honestly didn't want to end. I started reading it more slowly and not reading too much each day because I didn't want it to be over. I was enjoying it that much. So I honestly don't think I know anyone else who's actually read the book. I know a lot of other people who've seen the movie. So I really hope that more people will pick up the book because it's incredible, and when you watch the movie, you don't even get the second half. That I think, even though it has a little less plot than the first half, I really think it's every bit as good as the first half. So I really hope that this one comes back out of obscurity and becomes more popular again, because it is easily one of the best books I read this year. And now at last we come to number 1, which is going to be interesting to talk about because I think this is going to be a pretty unpopular opinion. But what I currently consider to be my number 1 read for the year, my favorite book that I read in 2024, is Elantris by Brandon Sanderson, which, if you're familiar with the Brandon Sanderson fandom, you may be kind of surprised about, because everybody talks about Elantris as being Brandon Sanderson's weakest novel. It was the first novel that he published. Even Brandon Sanderson himself has talked about Elantris being the weakest of his published novels. So I came into it, mainly I was just reading this as preparation for reading Wind and Truth, which I'm like 70% of the way through right now, and also enjoying a lot. But I did not have very high expectations for Elantris. I was just kind of trying to collect all of the Cosmere reads that I could so that I could get as many Easter eggs as possible in Wind and Truth. This was just an extra that I was going to toss in there. And it ended up being my favorite Sanderson book that I read so far. And I've read a lot of Sanderson books. I mean, I made a video about how many Sanderson books I read in 2022 because it was like 8 or something. I've read a lot of Brandon Sanderson books. And this was my favorite one so far. And it's like everybody else's least favorite, which is really funny. After I read it, I went to Goodreads and started reading some reviews because I was like, am I missing something? Is there like something really bad about this book that I just missed? Because I cannot see for the life of me why people are always talking about why it's worse than the other books. And what I found was that the general consensus is not that Elantris is bad. It's just that people find it not as good as the other books, which is fair. If you like Brandon Sanderson's other books better, that's totally fine. But this just had more of the elements that I personally connected to and found really interesting and really fun to read about. The book is told through 3 main characters. One of them is Prince, who gets turned into an Elantrian, which getting turned into an Elantrian in this world formerly meant getting turned into like this superhuman, near immortal being. And it was a great thing, but then something happened. Something about this process broke, and now becoming an Elantrian basically means you become a zombie and you get thrown into the dead city of Elantris, which is super atmospheric. Like, not that fun to live in, but a lot of fun to read about because it's very atmospheric and vibesy. The second character is Serene, who is a princess from a different country who is arriving to marry the prince, but by the time she gets there, the prince has been turned into an Elantrian and everybody just says he's dead. And she's like, well, that kind of stinks, but she still sticks around and is trying to help out with the issues going on in the kingdom. And then the third main character is this warrior priest who's coming in to try to force everybody in the kingdom to convert to his religion so that his government doesn't, quote unquote, have to wipe them all out. So I really like that the book was just restricted to these 3 characters' POV. Later in the book there are a couple other POVs, but pretty much it's just these 3 characters, and I really liked focusing in on these 3 characters and having a very limited number of POVs. I enjoyed all 3 of the POVs. I was never sure like which one I was looking forward to when I was reading because I would end up enjoying all of them. I really liked, again, the atmosphere of Elantris. I really liked what the characters did with the rough situations that they were thrown into and how they were like, well, this stinks. This isn't how I wanted life to be, but I'm going to take the situation and I'm going to make the most that I can of it, and I'm going to do my best to help the other people who are stuck in this situation. I really liked all the characters on the good side and how they worked together. I thought that the villains were interesting. One thing that sometimes people don't love about this book is that it's kind of slow in the middle, but another theme of what I'm saying about books this year is that I don't mind slow parts if I really like the characters enough. I don't mind the pacing being kind of a problem if I enjoy the main pieces of the story enough that I can just kind of overlook it. That was totally the case here. There is quite a bit of chapters that focus more on the characters or the theme. Maybe it was a little repetitive at times, but again, I don't care because overall I really liked it. Another thing that some people didn't like as much was that the setting, the plot, the characters follow a lot more typical fantasy archetypes. And another thing that you've probably noticed as a theme in this video is I really like fantasy archetypes. I really like those familiar tropes if they're done in a kind of unique and just in a high quality way. So I actually really like that about this book as well, even the familiar elements. I thought that the climax was just really powerful. There was a lot of build up throughout the story for stuff that you know has to happen. I was like, okay, is this actually going to be worth the build up when it shows up? Yeah, it's worth the build up when it shows up. And I just had so much fun with this book. Again, it was a fun read, and I finished it and I was like, what is wrong with this book? Why do people think that there's stuff wrong with this book? I failed to find anything that was wrong with this book. So I can understand some of the reasons why people say it's not their favorite. I can understand some of the reasons why people prefer Brandon Sanderson's later books. But this was just the one that was more along the lines of what I prefer. So I am naming it my #1 read of 2024, completely against my expectations. I also have several honorable mention reads for this year that I'm going to be sharing with my newsletter subscribers. So if you would be interested in essentially getting my top 16 books of the year, in addition to my top 10, you can subscribe to my email newsletter using the link below. And if you do that before this Saturday, then you will get that email that I send out to my subscribers, where I share not only my top 10 reads of the year, but also 6 honorable mentions that I just couldn't not talk about. And also, if you sign up using the link that is in the description to this video, then you'll get a free audio recording of my short story, People of the Rain, which is from the book Voice of the Future, Volume 1, Stories of Family and Fearlessness, which if you read that this year, maybe it'll be on your top 10 reads of 2025 list. Who knows? Thank you for journeying with me into this new year, and I will see you next time. Bye.